Something happened to you during the blood moon. You may not have words for it yet, but something surfaced, a feeling you couldn't quite place, a thought that came back louder than it should have, a clarity about something in your life that you had been successfully managing not to face for months, possibly longer. The blood moon did what blood moons do. It pulled things up from beneath the surface, the way a tide lifts what the ocean floor has been quietly holding. And now Mercury Retrograde has arrived, and it is doing something that ancient traditions described with unusual precision. It is refusing to let what was exposed go back under. What the blood moon revealed, Mercury Retrograde will not allow you to bury again. That is not a punishment, it is a mechanism, and understanding that mechanism changes everything about how you move through the weeks ahead. Most people experience Mercury retrograde as disorder without cause. Technology fails, conversations collapse, plans dissolve, and people from the past resurface without invitation. The common advice circulating everywhere is to simply endure it. Make no major decisions, stay low, protect yourself until the period passes. But that advice misses the entire point. It treats Mercury retrograde as a disruption to survive rather than a phase to work with deliberately. What the ancient traditions that tracked Mercury understood, and what the Hermetic tradition preserved with notable precision, is that the retrograde is not happening at random. It is being directed at something specific, something that was already present in your field before the retrograde arrived. Something the blood moon finished illuminating only days ago. The disorder you're experiencing isn't the retrograde creating new problems. It is the field's honest response to being seen clearly for the first time. In the Hermetic tradition, Mercury corresponds to Hermes, and Hermes is not simply the messenger of the gods. He is the psychopomp, the figure who moves between realms, who crosses boundaries that others cannot, who exists in the liminal space between one state and another. Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great, the central figure of Hermetic teaching, is described as the master of three domains simultaneously, the sacred, the philosophical, and the natural world. Mercury, in this framework, is the principle of mind, of communication, and of the movement between the known and the unknown. When Mercury enters its retrograde phase, this principle doesn't disappear, it inverts. Instead of moving outward into new connections, new plans, new expressions of the mind's energy, it moves inward, into review, into what was left unfinished, into what was exposed by the last major energetic event and hasn't yet been genuinely integrated. If this kind of knowledge speaks to you, the kind that explains the mechanism behind what you're already experiencing, subscribe to this channel. This is where we take what ancient traditions preserved and bring it into direct, practical use. The Kybalion teaches the law of rhythm. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Every outward movement is followed by an inward movement of equal force. This principle operates in physical tides, in seasonal cycles, and in the cycles of personal expansion and integration. The blood moon was an outward swing, an amplification, a surface-level illumination of what had been held below awareness. Mercury retrograde is the inward swing that necessarily follows, not to undo what was revealed, because it cannot undo it, but to ensure the revelation is actually processed. The law of rhythm doesn't permit patterns to be exposed and then reburied without consequence. What surfaces must be integrated, or it surfaces again, louder at the next available moment with less warning than before. Ancient Vedic astrology tracked Mercury, called Buddha in Sanskrit, as the governing principle of the discriminating mind. The faculty that sorts experience, identifies patterns, and decides what is signal versus noise. When Buddha moves in retrograde, the Vedic tradition understood this as the discriminating mind turning back on itself, reviewing its own conclusions, re-examining what it previously decided was settled, reconsidering what it had classified as resolved. This is not a comfortable process. It is not designed to be comfortable. It is designed to be thorough. What the blood moon brought to the surface, the pattern you recognized, the feeling that returned, the clarity that arrived uninvited, is now subject to the scrutiny of this concentrated, inward-turning mind. The question Mercury Retrograde is asking is not, did you see it? The question is, now that you have seen it, what are you going to do? The Hermetic law of cause and effect states that every cause has its effect, and every effect has its cause. The blood moon was a cause. What it revealed, activated, and surfaced in your field, those are effects already set in motion. Mercury Retrograde doesn't add a new cause to this sequence. It extends the effect of the one that began during the lunar portal. The blood moon turned on a light in a room that had been dark for a long time. Mercury Retrograde is the period during which you are required to look at what that light revealed, because the switch cannot be turned off again until you have genuinely looked at it. Every ancient tradition that tracked both lunar and Mercury cycles understood that they function as a pair in this specific sequence. The moon exposes, Mercury compels the examination. Together, they form a complete cycle of revelation and integration that neither can accomplish alone. What makes this combination, blood moon followed closely by Mercury Retrograde, significant enough that ancient traditions documented it independently across multiple cultures, is the specific way these two forces amplify each other's work. Egyptian ceremonial records referenced lunar Mercury sequences as periods requiring what they described as inner inventory, a structured examination of the self's actual state relative to its intended direction. The Vedic tradition marked these combinations as windows of karmic surfacing, the period when what had been accumulated below awareness would inevitably rise. The Pythagorean tradition described Mercury's inward-turning energy following a peak lunar event as the second illumination. The moon provides emotional and subconscious illumination first. Mercury provides the mental and structural illumination that follows. 3 traditions. 1. Convergent observation. What the Hermetic tradition calls the mercurial principle, the aspect of mind that functions at the threshold between known and unknown, is at maximum concentration during a retrograde. What normally disperses outward across dozens of external concerns, your communications, your plans, your mental energy directed toward the future, is gathered inward. This concentration is exactly what makes the retrograde following a blood moon so specifically activating. The blood moon opened interior space that had been closed. The retrograde floods that space with concentrated mental attention. What was dark and unfelt becomes lit and undeniable. What was felt but undefined becomes named and specific. What was known in the body but unprocessed by the mind becomes available to conscious awareness. Mercury Retrograde is the translator between the body's knowing and the mind's understanding. After a blood moon that surfaced so much, there is a great deal to translate. Write in the comments. What came up for you during the blood moon? Begin with today's date and complete the sentence. I finally see what was exposed. The act of naming it precisely in writing is the first step of retrograde integration. Mercury won't let you ignore it, but you can choose to meet it deliberately rather than be overwhelmed by it. There are 3 specific things the blood moon exposed that Mercury Retrograde is now amplifying in your field. They correspond to the 3 domains that Mercury, as Hermes, governs in Hermetic tradition: the personal mind, the relational field, and the path of purpose. During a retrograde following a blood moon, all 3 domains activate simultaneously, which is why this period can feel as though everything is being examined at once, because it is. Each of the 3 has its own signature, its own way of making itself known in your experience, and its own specific practice for working with it intelligently during the retrograde window. At least one of these three is louder in your field than the others right now, possibly all three. The question is which one you've been most successfully managing not to see, because that is the one the retrograde is pressing hardest. The difficulty of this period is proportional to how much was being managed, rather than integrated, before the blood moon arrived. The ancient seers who tracked these cycles described what they observed with unusual consistency. Periods that combine lunar exposure with Mercury retrograde examination are not difficult because they introduce something new. They are difficult because they make it impossible to maintain the resources required to keep existing material hidden. The more had been suppressed, the more surfaces. The more surfaces, the more the retrograde has to work with. What you are experiencing right now in terms of internal noise, relational friction, or directional uncertainty is a direct reflection of how much the blood moon found when it looked, and the retrograde is not interested in letting that material drift back below the surface. It is interested in ensuring the work gets done. The first sign that the blood moon exposed something Mercury retrograde is now forcing you to face. A pattern you thought was finished has returned. You made this realization before. You had the conversation, the breakdown, or the breakthrough. You processed it, or believed you had, and now in the days following the blood moon, it is back. Not in exactly the same form, but unmistakably carrying the same essential energy. The same defensive response you believed you'd moved past. The same emotional signature appearing in a context where you least expected it. The same pull toward a behavior or belief system you were certain you had resolved. This is not evidence that your previous work was wasted. It is evidence that the pattern has roots that haven't been reached yet. The blood moon illuminated a surface layer. Mercury retrograde is directing your attention to what lies beneath it. The Hermetic law of correspondence, as above, so below, as below, so above, operates simultaneously across multiple layers of any system. A pattern in your life doesn't exist only at the level where it was first recognized. It exists at multiple depths at once, each level influencing the others while remaining somewhat independent. What heals at one layer genuinely heals at that layer, while a deeper layer may remain intact and continue influencing the field from below. This is not failure. It is the nature of layered systems. What the blood moon did, in its capacity to reach the subconscious field, was illuminate a deeper layer of the pattern than had previously been accessible to any prior healing work. Mercury retrograde is now directing the conscious mind to meet what the subconscious surfaced. The pattern hasn't returned because you failed. It has returned because you are now capable of reaching its actual source in a way you simply weren't before. When a pattern returns during Mercury retrograde, the instinctive response is frustration and shame. I already dealt with this. I thought this was done. The Vedic understanding of Buddha in retrograde specifically frames this response as misdirected. What feels like regression is the completion of an earlier process, not the failure of it. The initial healing work was real and necessary. It cleared the ground for a deeper excavation that couldn't be approached before the surface work was completed. The retrograde is now providing the conditions for that deeper work. What is asking to be seen is not what you missed in your previous work. It is what required the previous work to be done before it could even be approached at all. The pattern has returned not because you failed, but because you are ready to go deeper than you could before. The blood moon confirmed that readiness. Mercury retrograde is directing you toward it. There are three characteristic forms in which the first sign makes itself known. The first is emotional over-response, a reaction disproportionate to the trigger, where something small activates something much larger, and you find yourself in a response that clearly doesn't match the scale of the situation in front of you. The second is intrusive thought. A specific memory, person, or scenario returns to your mental space repeatedly. Regardless of how many times you redirect attention away from it, you redirect, it returns. You redirect again, it returns with more force. The third is a bodily signal, a persistent tightness, restlessness, or physical sensation that doesn't correspond to any obvious physical cause. The body holds patterns below the level of language. During this retrograde, the body is not quiet. If any of these three are active in your experience right now, you are in contact with the first sign. What not to do when the first sign appears is as important as knowing the practice. The instinctive response to a returning pattern is often shame. The belief that its return means something is permanently wrong, that you are not as healed as you thought, that the work you've done has failed. This response adds a second pattern on top of the first, without providing any clarity about either one. Shame is not a practice. It is a compounding of difficulty that serves the avoidance of the actual work rather than the completion of it. The Hermetic tradition addresses this directly. Patterns don't return because of personal failure. They return because of the layered nature of consciousness, which can only process what it is ready to process at the depth it is currently capable of reaching. The first sign invites not shame, but curiosity. What is at the source of this, at the deeper level, the blood moon just made accessible? Mercury Retrograde amplifies the intrusive thought dimension of the first sign in a specific way that distinguishes this period from ordinary mental restlessness. Under normal conditions, the mind can redirect attention away from unwanted material with moderate effort. A few redirections, and the material subsides to a manageable background level. During the retrograde, this redirection becomes significantly less effective. The mercurial energy is concentrated on exactly the material that needs examination, and it presses on that material persistently, returning attention to it regardless of how many times attention is moved away. This is not a malfunction of the mind. It is the retrograde's primary mechanism at work. The thought that keeps returning during this period is a message being delivered by the mercurial principle with the specific force of the concentrated retrograde. The thought is not the problem. It is the signal. Mercury, Hermes the messenger, is doing his work through it. If this content is opening something in you, let me know by liking this video. That feedback tells me this work is worth continuing. The practice for the first sign is not to resolve the pattern during the retrograde window. It is to locate its source question. Every recurring pattern, viewed through the Hermetic tradition, is a field formation organized around a question that has never received a genuine answer. Not a performed answer, not a coping mechanism, but a real response to the actual question beneath the pattern. Common source questions include, am I truly safe here? Do I deserve what I'm reaching for? Will this last, or will I lose it again? Am I enough exactly as I am without performance? Do I have to carry this alone? The practice is to sit with the pattern each morning for 5 minutes, before any external stimulus, before checking your phone, before speaking, and ask it one question. What are you protecting me from having to face? Write whatever arises without editing or analyzing it yet. During Mercury retrograde, access to the layer where the source question lives is significantly greater than at ordinary times. The retrograde's inward concentrated energy creates a kind of depth charge in the mental field. It reaches into layers that are normally below the reach of conscious attention. The daily 5-minute practice, repeated over several consecutive mornings of the retrograde period, produces something that a single session cannot: a gradual descent in the quality of what emerges. The first morning may produce intellectual explanations. The second or third morning, something closer to the felt truth begins to surface. By the fourth or fifth session, the source question itself tends to become visible, not as a new idea, but as a recognition. the deep sense of having finally named what was always there. That recognition is the beginning of genuine resolution rather than ongoing suppression. What emerges from the source question practice, when it goes deep enough, is almost always simpler than the complex narrative that had been constructed around the pattern. The surface layer of a pattern tends to be elaborate. Specific triggers, specific contexts, specific explanations for why it exists. The source layer is usually a single, simple question about fundamental safety, worth, belonging, or capacity. Finding that simple question beneath the elaborate structure doesn't immediately resolve the pattern, but it changes the relationship with it in a way that nothing else does. You stop fighting the pattern as though it were an enemy, and start understanding it as a field structure that was built to protect something that didn't feel safe enough to face directly. During the retrograde period, following the blood moon's deep surfacing, that level of honest contact with the pattern is available in a way it rarely is otherwise. The second sign that the blood moon exposed and Mercury retrograde won't let you ignore, a relationship, connection, or situation, is revealing its true frequency, and communication in its old form has become impossible to sustain without a level of effort that is now obviously disproportionate to what the connection actually returns. This is Mercury's domain in its most literal expression. Hermes, as the principle of communication and connection, governs the space between people, the field of exchange, the quality of what moves between you and others. During the retrograde, this field is examined with unusual clarity. What normally flows beneath the surface of interaction, unspoken expectations, misaligned assumptions, connections maintained through habit rather than genuine resonance, is brought into visibility. The communications that are now breaking down or becoming unusually charged are not random. They are the specific connections that were already out of alignment. The retrograde is simply making what was already true impossible to continue performing around. The ancient Greek understanding of Hermes as the figure who moves between realms has a precise application here. Hermes doesn't create misunderstanding. He reveals the gaps in understanding that were always present beneath the managed surface of interaction. The retrograde phase doesn't cause relationships to fracture. It reveals fractures that already existed beneath the smoothness that had been maintained through ongoing expenditure of energy and attention. What a blood moon followed by Mercury retrograde does to a relational field is this. The blood moon illuminates the actual frequency of each connection through its subconscious level amplification, and then the retrograde forces all communication to be conducted at that actual frequency rather than the performed one. This is why certain conversations during this period feel unusually raw, unusually stuck, or unusually honest. The performance resources have been withdrawn. What remains is the actual resonance of the connection. How to recognize the second sign, pay close attention to which specific communications are creating friction, and notice that it is never all of them, always specific ones. The connection where you keep meaning to have a particular conversation but consistently find reasons to defer it. The dynamic where something that used to feel natural now feels charged before it even begins. The situation where you leave interactions feeling consistently more drained than when you entered, without a clear external cause. These friction points were already present and already consuming energy before the retrograde arrived. The retrograde is removing the surplus energy you were using to maintain the performance of smoothness around the friction. What is now revealing itself, the frequency gap, the misalignment, the honest measurement of what the connection actually costs, was always the truth. The retrograde is holding up an honest measure for the first time without the usual distortion. The Hermetic law of vibration states, "Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. Every connection in your life is a vibrational relationship. Two fields in contact either resonate or they produce friction. When they resonate, interaction is naturally easy. Energy flows freely, understanding arises without effort. When they don't resonate, when the frequencies are genuinely misaligned, interaction requires significant ongoing effort. Energy is consumed by the gap, and understanding is always slightly off-register regardless of how carefully the communication is managed. The blood moon, by amplifying your field to its maximum clarity, made the difference between resonant and non-resonant connections unusually perceptible. Mercury retrograde is now requiring you to do something with that perception, not to immediately restructure your relational field, but to see clearly, without the distortion of active management, which connections feed your field and which consistently draw from it without comparable return. The practice for the second sign is structured non-management of each friction point for 3 consecutive days. For each relationship or situation where friction has become visible, refrain from attempting to fix the dynamic, explain it away, smooth it over, or address it directly during those 3 days. Simply observe it without managing it. This is not avoidance. It is precise data collection. The Hermetic tradition teaches that you cannot accurately assess a dynamic while actively managing it. The management itself consumes the perceptual capacity needed for honest evaluation. What you can see while managing is only the managed version. The interaction as it appears through the performance of smoothness. What you see during 3 days of deliberate non-management is the actual dynamic, measured without distortion. 3 days of honest observation during Mercury retrograde, following the blood moon's frequency exposure, will reveal what months of careful navigation never could. What reveals itself during those 3 days of non-management is almost always simpler and more honest than the stories that had been constructed around the friction. The external explanations, the circumstantial narratives about why the friction exists, whose fault it is, what recent events caused it, tend to fall away when the management stops. What remains is a direct perception. Is the frequency gap between you and this connection something that can genuinely be bridged through mutual movement? Or does it reflect 2 fields operating at fundamentally different frequencies, where the gap requires more energy to manage than either field can sustainably provide? That perception, arrived at without the distortion of performance and management, is what the blood moon was working to show you, and what Mercury retrograde is now ensuring you actually look at. The second sign doesn't resolve through conversation during the retrograde. It resolves through honest perception of what was always there. After the 3 days of non-management, the frequency mapping exercise begins. For each connection where friction was visible, write 1 honest sentence. The actual frequency of this connection is honest assessment, and sustaining it currently costs me honest description of what it takes. Not good or bad, not right or wrong, simply honest. This mapping exercise removes the narrative layers and leaves a direct, energetic reading. The Hermetic law of correspondence makes this precise. What you can see clearly on the inner level, you can eventually address clearly in the outer. What remains hidden beneath narrative and performance cannot be meaningfully changed because it hasn't been honestly seen. The map is not the action. The relational decisions that follow the retrograde are not made during it. But without the map, every subsequent action is navigating blind in a field that the blood moon already illuminated. The map makes the illumination usable. The third sign that the blood moon exposed and Mercury retrograde is making impossible to ignore. Your direction is being questioned at a level deeper than ordinary uncertainty, not the everyday doubt of a specific decision. Something more foundational. A questioning of the larger arc, the path you chose, the identity you've been building toward, the future you've been operating from as though it were already decided. During Mercury retrograde, following a blood moon, this kind of deep directional questioning is not a crisis. It is the law of cause and effect, completing a necessary cycle. The blood moon surfaced the deeper truth of where you actually are right now. Mercury retrograde is asking whether the direction you've been moving in was chosen from that deeper truth, or from a version of yourself that the blood moon just revealed as incomplete. The question is not an attack on the direction. It is the field asking for an update. The Hermetic tradition places Mercury, Hermes, specifically at crossroads. In the ancient world, Hermes, stone markers associated with Hermes, were placed at intersections, at thresholds, at the points between one territory and another. Hermes is the guardian of the liminal space, the in-between where one state has ended and the next has not yet begun. Mercury retrograde is therefore in this tradition a threshold period, a structured interval between what was decided before and what will be decided next. After a blood moon, which revealed something about your actual frequency, your actual patterns, your actual relational field, the direction you've been moving in is now being held against that new information, not because the direction was necessarily wrong, because it was chosen by a version of you that didn't have access to what the blood moon just showed you. The threshold is where you update the map. How to recognize the third sign? The unmistakable characteristic is a decision that you thought was made now feeling unmade. Not because circumstances have changed, but because you have changed in your understanding of yourself. You may find yourself in the middle of a plan, a commitment, a trajectory, or a goal that now feels as though it was chosen by someone who didn't have all the relevant information. Not wrong, necessarily, but incomplete, possibly misaligned with something deeper than was visible when the choice was originally made. This feeling, the reopened question, the direction suddenly uncertain, is Mercury retrograde's most significant signal. It is not asking you to abandon everything at once. It is asking you to hold the direction you've been moving in up to the light of what you now know, and to decide again from that knowing rather than from the momentum of the original choice made before the blood moon looked. The ancient traditions were consistent on one critical point about Mercury retrograde. It is not a time for new decisions. It is the optimal time to revisit existing ones with more complete information. The Vedic tradition specifically prescribed the retrograde period for re-examination, revision, and the clearing of incomplete mental processes, not for committing to new directions or launching new initiatives. What was left unfinished in the mind, what was decided without full awareness, what was committed to before the deeper truth was visible, these are what the retrograde is designed to process. The blood moon provided the new information. Mercury retrograde creates the conditions for that information to be properly integrated into your sense of direction before you continue building from it. This is not stagnation. It is precision. The decisions made after genuine retrograde integration produce qualitatively different results than those made before it. The directional questioning of the third sign tends to be most disorienting for those who have invested significantly in a particular vision of their future, a path that felt certain, a version of themselves they were building toward with real effort and real sacrifice. The disorientation is proportional to the investment, but it is also proportional to the gap between where that path was leading and where the deeper truth the blood moon revealed actually points. Mercury retrograde is not trying to take away what you have built. It is trying to ensure that what you continue to build is constructed on an honest understanding of who you actually are, not on a performance of who you were presenting yourself as before the blood moon arrived and looked more carefully. The questioning is precision, not punishment. The threshold is serving you. The practice for the third sign is a path inventory, a written examination of what you have been moving toward, viewed through the lens of what the blood moon revealed. Sit with a blank page and ask a specific question. What have I been moving toward? And was the version of me who chose that direction working with the information I now have? Do not rush to answer. Let the question sit in your consciousness for several minutes before writing. What emerges is often not a clean answer, but a series of more specific sub-questions. Questions that reveal where the original direction was built on assumptions rather than on honest knowledge about who you are at the deeper level. Those sub-questions are more valuable than premature answers. They form the most honest map of your direction that you have yet produced, and they give the retrograde's directional questioning a structure through which it can complete its work. If you've been working with these principles but feel like something beneath strategy keeps interfering, something below the level you can consciously address that keeps pulling back what you're building, I left something in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to work at the level of the actual field, where the real patterns live. What the path inventory almost always reveals is not that your direction was entirely wrong. It reveals that the direction was built on a partial map, that it accounts for the version of yourself that was visible before the blood moon, but doesn't yet account for what the blood moon showed you at the deeper level. That is not a failure of the original direction. It is the natural consequence of the fact that every decision is made with the information available at the time it is made. The blood moon provided new information. The path inventory is how you update the map before continuing to navigate from it. What you build after the retrograde, from a map that includes what the blood moon revealed, is built on fundamentally more honest ground than anything constructed from the previous partial picture of who you are. The path inventory reveals something additional that is worth understanding before moving through it. The questions that emerge don't all need to be answered during the retrograde. The retrograde is the optimal time for gathering the questions, not necessarily for resolving them. The Mercurial principle, in its inward phase, concentrates on excavation, on finding and naming what was not previously visible. Resolution comes after the retrograde lifts and the mercurial energy returns to its outward direction, carrying the clarity of everything the retrograde examined. What you collect during the retrograde, the questions, the honest assessments, the depth of pattern dialogue practice, is the raw material for the decisions and directions that follow. Mercury retrograde is the preparation phase. What comes after it, for those who used it deliberately, is a quality of forward movement that would not have been possible without it. Here is what the ancient traditions preserved about periods when a blood moon and Mercury retrograde occur in close sequence. They called it the exposure and the reckoning. The exposure happened during the lunar portal, the surfacing of patterns, the illumination of relational frequency gaps, the revelation of directional misalignments. The reckoning is what is happening now. Reckoning, in its original navigational meaning, is not judgment. It is accurate positioning, determining exactly where you are before setting a new course. You cannot navigate accurately from a position you only believe yourself to occupy. The blood moon gave you an accurate position reading. Mercury retrograde is the period during which you update your charts before sailing again. Every course correction made from accurate positioning produces fundamentally different results than every correction made from a false belief about where you stand. The integration protocol for this period has a foundation that underlies all three signs. Deliberate review, which is structurally different from rumination. Rumination is the mind returning to the same material in a loop, without direction, without extraction, without movement toward any kind of resolution. Deliberate review is structured. You bring specific material into conscious attention, examine it through the framework of the Hermetic laws, and extract what it is showing you about the pattern, the connection, or the direction in question. During Mercury retrograde, the material for deliberate review is being selected by the retrograde itself, presenting itself as the thoughts you can't stop returning to, the conversations you keep replaying, the feelings that won't resolve. The integration protocol is to meet that material with structure rather than avoidance or reactivity. Structure is what transforms the retrograde from something that happens to you into something you move through deliberately. For the first sign, the daily practice is 5 minutes of pattern dialogue each morning before any external input. Sit with the returning pattern and ask it one question. What are you protecting me from having to face? Write whatever arises without editing. Repeat this each morning of the retrograde period. Over consecutive sessions, what emerges descends from intellectual explanation toward felt recognition, the source question becoming visible not as a new idea, but as something always present, now finally named. That naming is the beginning of genuine resolution, because it changes the relationship with the pattern. You stop fighting the pattern and start understanding what it has been organized around. The pattern that has been serving as a protective structure loses the pressure to continue operating protectively, once what it was protecting you from is openly acknowledged. For the second sign, the practice combines the 3-day non-management protocol with the frequency mapping exercise. After 3 days of deliberate observation without management, write one honest sentence about each friction point. The actual frequency of this connection is assessment, and maintaining it currently costs me description. Not narrative, not story, just the direct energetic reading. Then ask the additional question, is this a gap that genuine mutual movement could bridge or a fundamental frequency difference? That question, answered honestly after 3 days of unmanaged observation, provides the most accurate information available about each connection. The map that emerges is not an immediate action plan. It is data that after the retrograde can be used to make relational decisions from an honest understanding of what each connection actually is, rather than from the story maintained around it. For the third sign, the integration practice is a daily addition to the path inventory, combined with one specific commitment: not advancing any major direction form before the blood moon without first completing at least one session of the path inventory practice. Each day, add one question to the inventory, a question that the previous session surfaced about whether your direction accounts for what you now know about yourself. At the end of the retrograde period, you will have a collection of questions that together form the most honest map of your direction you have yet produced. Not answers, questions. Mercury Retrograde honors the question that cannot be quickly resolved. The answers will come after the retrograde lifts, when the inward-turning mercurial energy reverses and becomes outward again, carrying the clarity and precision of everything the retrograde examined in its concentrated, thorough inward phase. The end point of Mercury retrograde, following a blood moon, is not a return to what was before. Most people assume they will endure the period and then pick up where they left off, as though the retrograde were a pause. But emerging from this combination means emerging as someone who has genuinely seen 3 things they were previously managing not to see. Someone whose pattern is understood at a new depth. Someone whose relational field has been assessed with unusual honesty. Someone whose direction has been examined against the truth of who they actually are, rather than who they were performing themselves to be. That person doesn't return to where they were before the blood moon. They advance from a fundamentally different, more honest foundation. And what they build from that foundation has a structural integrity that what came before it didn't have. There is a hermetic teaching on Mercury that is rarely discussed outside esoteric contexts. Hermes was the only figure in Greek mythology permitted to travel freely between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between what is known and what is hidden. Mercury retrograde represents the inversion of that movement. Instead of information traveling outward from hidden to known, the known is drawn inward toward examination by what had been hidden. You are not being pulled somewhere dark. You are being given access to the layer beneath the surface, the layer where actual decisions about your frequency, your patterns, and your direction are being made below conscious awareness. Most people never visit that layer voluntarily. Mercury retrograde, following a blood moon, removes the option to avoid it. The forced access is the gift concealed inside everything that is currently difficult. What the ancient traditions documented about ignoring the three signs is consistent across frameworks. The cycle completes regardless of conscious participation. Mercury retrograde ends on its own schedule and the period passes. But the material that was surfaced by the blood moon and pressed by the retrograde doesn't disappear when the retrograde lifts. It returns to the subconscious field in a more charged state, because now it has been seen and then re-avoided. The next major energetic event will surface it again with greater intensity than before. The law of cause and effect doesn't forgive uncompleted cycles. It reschedules them at closer intervals with increasing force until completion occurs. The ancient seers documented this pattern not to create fear, but to be accurate about how the field operates. The question is never whether the material will eventually be integrated. It will be. The only variable is whether you integrate it now, deliberately or later, under increasing pressure. The discomfort of this Mercury retrograde period, following the blood moon's exposure, is not the cost of growth. It is the growth itself, occurring in real time and visible in your experience. What is moving through your field right now, the pattern that returned, the relational truth that surfaced, the directional question that won't resolve, is the transformation of raw exposure into actual integration happening in your lived experience. Hermetic tradition has always understood that transformation is not a process that occurs in comfortable, convenient conditions. It occurs when the conditions are precisely what they are right now, when what was hidden has been surfaced, when the field is being examined with unusual concentration, when the comfortable performances that prevented clear seeing have been stripped by the retrograde's concentrated inward energy. This is what transformation feels like from the inside. Not comfortable, accurate. You didn't find this video by accident. The content that surfaces for you during Mercury retrograde is never random, because the retrograde concentrates the mercurial principle of attention, and concentrated attention moves with precision toward exactly what it needs to examine. If this video appeared in your field today, in this period, in the days following the blood moon, something in your field navigated toward it, not your logical mind performing a deliberate search. Something operating at the level that the blood moon activated, and Mercury retrograde is now bringing to the threshold of conscious awareness. The three signs described here are not abstract categories. At least one is active and visible in your experience right now. The recognition of which one is loudest is itself the first genuine step toward working with what the blood moon surfaced, rather than continuing to manage it from a distance. The ancient promise preserved in every tradition that understood Mercury retrograde as mechanism is this: what is honestly examined during the retrograde emerges stronger after it. Not because the retrograde grants strength, but because honesty does. The pattern seen clearly at its source loses its power to operate from the depths unseen. The connection assessed accurately for its actual frequency can be engaged from truth rather than from managed performance around what the frequency actually is. The direction re-examined honestly against who you actually are can be confirmed or revised from real knowledge rather than from assumption. What the retrograde is processing in your field right now is the transformation of exposure into integration. And integration, Hermetic tradition is consistent on this across every framework that preserved it, is the only foundation on which genuine expansion is built and on which what you build actually holds. 3 signs, 3 domains, 3 practices. 1 foundation, deliberate review of what the blood moon surfaced, brought to structure rather than left to avoidance. The weeks of this Mercury retrograde period are not weeks to wait through. They are weeks to use, with the full understanding that the processing is happening regardless of whether you participate consciously. The question is only whether the integration is directed by you or done to you. The pattern, the relational field, the direction, these 3 are being examined in your field right now, with or without your conscious cooperation. What the ancient traditions preserved specific practices for was this. Conscious participation in the retrograde's work produces something that passive experience of it does not. Genuine resolution rather than temporary suppression, honest assessment rather than resumed management, real recalibration rather than a return to a false position. That is the difference between knowing what Mercury retrograde is and using what it makes available. The ancient traditions were also consistent on what comes after a Mercury retrograde that follows a blood moon, a period of unusual forward clarity. The person who moves through this retrograde with genuine engagement, who does the pattern dialogue practice, who conducts the honest frequency mapping, who completes the path inventory with real honesty, exits the retrograde period with a quality of directional clarity that is simply not available to someone who waited it out. The clarity comes not from the retrograde granting something new, but from the retrograde removing what was obscuring the clear view that was always there. The blood moon cleared the debris from the surface. The retrograde cleared it from the layers below. What remains, after both have done their work, is the actual field. Unobscured, honest, ready to move. What you choose to do with the clarity that follows the retrograde is the continuation of the process the blood moon and Mercury initiated. The pattern, seen at its source, can now be addressed with tools that actually reach where the pattern lives. The relational field, assessed with honest frequency mapping, can now be engaged with decisions based on what the connections actually are, rather than on the performance maintained around them. The direction, re-examined through the path inventory, can now be confirmed or revised from the most honest self-knowledge you have had access to in a long time. These 3 things together, the pattern addressed at source, the relational field engaged honestly, the direction built from accurate self-knowledge, form the foundation of everything the ancient traditions described as genuine expansion. Not expansion from the false position, expansion from the real one. Hermetic tradition preserves a teaching about the quality of work done in and after periods like this one. What is built in the period of maximum clarity that follows a thorough retrograde review has a structural integrity that work done at other times often lacks. It is built on ground that has been fully examined. It is built by a self that has seen its own patterns, assessed its own field, and revised its own direction from honest knowledge. The ancient practitioners who moved through Moon-Mercury sequences deliberately, who used the exposure of the blood moon and the review of the retrograde as a complete cycle rather than 2 disruptions, described the results consistently as movement at a quality that surprised even them, not because the external conditions had changed, because the internal field from which all external results emerge had been fundamentally clarified. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I see it now and I'm ready to face it." I've placed another lesson on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.